a critically important piece of history I want to go over today. The most famous woman when it comes to firearms in American history, as I see it, is Annie Oakley. I want to talk to you about this woman who is so incredibly important to guns in America, and yet her story is largely lost in the 21st century, and we want to bring it back. Very important to do so. You'll see why in one moment. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, and New York Times best-selling author. If you have not subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so. We're working really hard to try to get to 100,000 subscribers because it would be really good for the social media algorithms if we can get to that number. So we're working hard to do so, and we'd appreciate your help in helping us get there. Probably the most famous woman when it comes to firearms in American life, extremely important. Someone is lost to history to some degree, is Annie Oakley, the star, the person, the inspiration of the Broadway musical and the movie Annie Get Your Gun. Her story is bigger than any myth that you've ever heard. Annie Oakley is someone that we all must know about. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, Annie Oakley, who was a sharpshooter originally from Ohio that put meat on her table from her sharpshooting when she was a young girl, started shooting when she was literally in single digits, she became the most famous woman in America in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when she toured with the Buffalo Bill, that's William Cody, Buffalo Bill Wild West show. But that's not the only reason why she was famous and so important when it came to firearms in America. She literally was a one-woman NRA. Now, before I give you Annie Oakley's full story, I want to just give you a little bit of background and give you some information about how important she was to firearms in American life. You see, Annie Oakley wasn't just a great trick shooter and sharpshooter. Annie Oakley literally was a one-woman NRA. And what I mean by that is that she was a woman who fully supported the right to keep and bear arms for American women. She literally taught thousands upon thousands of women to carry guns in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and train them in firearms and the effective use of firearms. So much so that at one point in time, she wrote to the President of the United States saying that to the extent that the United States ever got back into another war, she would deliver hundreds upon hundreds of sharpshooting women that she would lead into battle to help take out the enemy. That's how important and significant she was. Now, Annie Oakley, just to give you a little bit of context, she was born in 1860. She became a crack shooter learning from her father. At the age of 15, she was such a good shot that when another famous sharpshooter or trick shooter by the name of Frank Butler came to her town, they set up a contest between the 15-year-old Annie Oakley and the much older Frank Butler. And they competed by shooting 25 targets each. Frank Butler, who was a crack shot 24 of the 25 targets. Despite laughing at the 15-year-old girl as his competition, Annie Oakley shot 25 out of 25 targets and defeated Frank Butler to his great embarrassment. So she got him back, though, because less than a year later, guess what? They were married, and Frank Butler and Annie Oakley spent 50 happy years together as a married couple. And then when they ultimately died in 1926, believe it or not, Annie Oakley and her husband, Frank Butler, the other sharpshooter that they met, they actually died within 3 weeks of each other. So it was a lifelong love affair. But beyond that, Annie Oakley, you have to understand, was such an important figure that she was the best woman shot. She became world famous in the Wild West show, sponsored, of course, by Buffalo Bill. They traveled around the world, and she basically was a great pioneer and proponent of private self-defense, the use of firearms for self-defense. She even was able to shoot in front of the future King of England in Wimbledon. Highly unusual for this, but that's how great of a shot she was when she went over there and displayed her firearms prowess and American firearms prowess in Wimbledon, England, for the future King of England. The reason why I want you to really understand Annie Oakley is because to the extent you have daughters or granddaughters or sons or grandsons for that matter that are interested in firearms and want to do book reports or write reports or learn or read books about history, a great character in history is Annie Oakley because she was such a big inspiration that she literally inspired a Broadway musical called Annie Get Your Gun and a movie and so on and so on and so on. That's how important she was. But again, the real history here is that she was a huge proponent of private gun ownership across the United States. And here's an example. There's a famous woman, a historian, an author by the name of Glenda Riley. She wrote a great book. You may want to check it out, called The Life and Legacy of Annie Oakley. She published it with the University of Oklahoma in 1994. And again, I'm going to read some stuff from Glenda Riley's book about how important Annie Oakley was to private gun ownership in the United States and how she urged women to go out and get guns. By the way, as a side note, Annie Oakley did not support women's suffrage, so she took some contemporary criticism back then. She did not think women should have the right to vote, but she did think they should have the right to keep and bear arms and protect themselves against predators in society. Kind of an interesting fact there. So this is some of the information that we get from Glenda Riley in her book, The Life and Legacy of Annie Oakley. This is what she writes. Annie Oakley recommended that every woman learn to use a revolver that she kept by her side, whether at home or on the streets. A woman equipped with a gun and the knowledge to use it properly, Annie said, could be courageous and self-reliant when home alone, for revolvers were excellent life preservers. Excellent life preservers. A woman who kept her gun in an accessible but safe place could easily scare off a robber or a murderer, or if she wished to make an example of him, maim him without killing him. That was Annie Oakley, believe it or not. And let me continue on with Miss Riley's book here, where she wrote an extensive treatment of the history of Annie Oakley, an important historical figure. Again, I keep encouraging people to learn about her because, again, her story is getting lost to time because the women that are getting propped up as famous by people like Hillary Clinton, who I don't necessarily view are on par with Annie Oakley. But that's a conversation for another day. Here's another segment out of Miss Riley's book. Annie Oakley revealed her strength and determination by continuing to encourage women to take up shooting. By 1900, she argued that shooting need not detract from a lady's qualities. She also remarked on the numbers of women who had taken up shooting and competed with men on their own ground in recent years. Then in 1901, Annie Oakley declared, quote, any woman who does not thoroughly enjoy tramping across the country on a clear, frosty morning with a good gun and a pair of dogs does not know how to enjoy life. God intended women to be outside as well as men, and they do not know what they are missing when they stay cooped up in a house with a novel. Novel reading was an activity that Annie Oakley deplored. Well, I'm perfectly fine reading some novels, if they're historical novels, of course, that's my view. But with that said, I do agree being outside with a gun is far more fun as a general matter than reading some of the novels that I've seen out there. But let me continue on. This again is from Glenda Riley's book, The Life and Legacy of Annie Oakley. She also explained about Annie Oakley the following, that when a woman was in the streets, Annie Oakley urged during a 1904 visit to Cincinnati, Ohio. Remember, Annie Oakley was from Ohio. So in 1904, when Annie Oakley visited Cincinnati, Ohio, she said she should not, and this is her advice, this is Annie Oakley's advice, she said that a woman should not carry her revolver in her handbag, but should have it ready at all times by concealing it within the folds of a small umbrella when she's in the streets. Right? Wearing a stylish floor-length dress with full sleeves and a high collar, Annie posed for photographs showing women exactly how to prepare themselves and their umbrellas to fend off thieves or murderous attacks. Annie Oakley also warned women to be ready to shoot before the enemy shoots. Her concern was justified, for around the turn of the century, urban ills were increasing at an alarming rate while women were spending more time in city streets than they had formerly. In other words, she was advising women to conceal carry guns in their parasols and in their umbrellas when they walk the streets of these cities. Good advice back in the 19th century, good advice at the turn of the 20th century, and good advice in the 21st century as far as I'm concerned. Now, let me also add this from Glenda Riley in her book, The Life and Legacy of Annie Oakley. I think in some ways the most interesting story about Annie Oakley and her encouragement of women and firearms occurred at the end of the 19th century in April of 1898. During that time, Annie Oakley wrote a letter to President William McKinley, assuring President McKinley that she felt confident that they would not go to war under his good judgment. That was what she hoped. But here was what she said to the president. Annie Oakley wrote that in case war did erupt with Spain, between the United States and Spain, Annie Oakley was prepared to, quote, place a company of 50 lady sharpshooters at his disposal. Annie guaranteed, quote, every one of them will be an American, and as they will furnish their own arms. Did you hear that? They will furnish their own arms and ammunition. They will be of little expense, if any, to the government. Did you hear what I just said? This is 1898. Annie Oakley writes to the President of the United States, William McKinley, the following. This is her language, not mine. She says that if war breaks out between Spain and the United States, then she will, quote, place a company of 50 lady sharpshooters at the government's disposal. And she also writes specifically her language, not mine, quote, every one of them, the women, will be an American, and as they will furnish their own guns and ammunition, will be of very little expense, if any, to the government, close quote. And he sent this letter on her special stationery, which featured a half-page letterhead declaring she's America's representative lady shot. And guess what? It turns out that President McKinley did not take her up on her offer. There was no war in Spain that required Annie Oakley and her women sharpshooters to go fight. Lucky for them and lucky for all of us, but she was certainly ready to fight and bring women to the front if necessary. So bottom line is that Annie Oakley, who was so important, not just as a famous celebrity, but she was so impressive that the famous Sitting Bull, Sitting Bull, the Sioux leader, the Lakota Sioux leader that was involved with the demise of General George Custer at Custer's last stand, Sitting Bull was so impressed when he met and watched Annie Oakley shoot that he actually proposed to her that she become his adopted daughter. And that's exactly what happened. So it turns out that Annie Oakley's life was so crazy and exciting that she became the adopted daughter of Sitting Bull of George Custer demise fame. And that's how important Annie Oakley was. So to summarize this, I just want to let you know here, there are many historical figures. We probably should do more coverage of some of these historical figures on this channel, but there's one mission critical person you really need to know and encourage your children and grandchildren and others to know about. That's Annie Oakley. She is a one-woman NRA, a one-woman supporter of the right to keep and bear arms. Extremely important, extremely famous, was world-renowned and well-deserved, and she was totally on our team when it came to the right to keep and bear arms. And if she were around today, I have no doubt that she'd be a sitting U.S. Senator or Congresswoman or some other critically important person in our fight to maintain and keep our fundamental right to keep and bear arms as protected by, among other things, the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Okay, I hope you learned a little bit something about Annie Oakley. Check out the book by Glenda Riley if you haven't done so. If you have any interest in reading further, definitely a great book on the life and legacy of Annie Oakley. And again, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. We're trying to hit the 100,000 subscriber mark. We're working hard to get there. And again, we'll see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.